Gideon sat completely paralyzed in the center of the gleaming, glass-walled boardroom, his heart violently hammering against his ribs as he watched his entire life's work go up in flames on a massive 80-inch screen. Just 3 days ago he had ruthlessly fired his fiercely loyal 8-month pregnant assistant, tossing her out of his office with zero severance, just to save a few $1,000s on her upcoming maternity leave. He thought he was a financial genius. He thought she was just a helpless, disposable problem who would quietly disappear. But as the horrifying, crystal-clear hidden camera footage of his cruel betrayal played loudly for the entire board of directors to see, Gideon's massive ego completely shattered. Because as the video ended and the boardroom lights flicked back on, Gideon realized the absolute worst part of his waking nightmare. The person standing at the head of the table holding the remote, the person who had just single-handedly orchestrated his total professional execution, was none other than the pregnant assistant he had so cruelly discarded. And she wasn't there to ask for her job back. She was there to take his. Welcome back to Moments and Meanings. Before we uncover the shocking twist in today's story, take a quick second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below, have you ever worked for a toxic boss who only cared about money and profits? In a world obsessed with corporate greed and climbing to the top, it is terrifyingly easy for arrogant leaders to treat their most loyal employees like disposable objects. Today, we are diving into a deeply emotional, high-stakes story about a ruthless executive who thought firing his pregnant assistant was just a smart, victimless business move. But the devastating lesson he learns about loyalty, hidden cameras, and the ultimate, life-shattering revenge will completely change how you view the people who work behind the scenes. Let's begin. Gideon ruled the 72nd floor of the Apex Financial Tower with an iron fist and a heart entirely devoid of empathy. At 38 years old, he was the Senior Director of Acquisitions, a title he wore like a heavy diamond-encrusted crown. His massive corner office was a sprawling monument to his unchecked toxic ego, filled with imported Italian leather furniture, abstract art that cost more than a working-class family's home, and floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed him to literally look down on the city below. For Gideon, human beings were not people. They were simply numbers on a glowing spreadsheet. They were either assets that made him money, or liabilities that cost him money. And currently, his sharp, predatory eyes were locked onto a liability waddling through the heavy glass doors of his office. Linnea, his fiercely loyal executive assistant, was carefully balancing a tray of steaming black coffee, 2 heavily researched market projection binders, and a thick stack of incoming mail. She was exactly 8 months pregnant, her normally quick, highly efficient steps significantly slowed by the heavy, uncomfortable weight of her 3rd trimester. Unlike Gideon, who wore custom-tailored silk suits imported directly from Milan, Linnea wore simple, faded maternity dresses from discount department stores. Her husband had recently lost his warehouse job, and they were desperately scraping together every single penny to prepare for the arrival of their first child. Linnea had been Gideon's assistant for 5 grueling, thankless years. She was the invisible, desperately underpaid engine that kept his highly lucrative career running. She routinely worked 12-hour days, skipped her own lunch breaks, and meticulously fixed his catastrophic financial errors before upper management ever saw them. But Gideon didn't value her profound loyalty. He didn't care about her late nights or her sacrifices. As he watched her gently place the hot coffee on his immaculate desk, his upper lip curled in profound, toxic disgust, all he saw was an impending, incredibly expensive 6-month maternity leave. But what Gideon didn't realize as he rudely snatched the coffee from her trembling hands was that Linnea was harboring a massive, life-altering secret about her true identity, one that would soon violently tear his empire to the ground. "It's lukewarm," Linnea Gideon snapped aggressively, slamming the expensive porcelain mug back onto the mahogany desk, causing hot coffee to violently splash over the rim and stain a document. "If I wanted lukewarm garbage, I would have bought it from the street vendor downstairs. Remind me again why I pay you?" Linnea physically flinched, her exhausted, slightly puffy eyes instantly dropping to the floor in submission. "I deeply apologize, Mr. Gideon. The elevator banks were stalled on the 50th floor. I also stayed up until 3 a.m. last night recalculating the Orion merger documents. I found a massive $3 million discrepancy in the opposing counsel's paperwork. I fixed it for you so you wouldn't be blindsided in today's board meeting." Instead of thanking her for literally saving his entire reputation and millions of company dollars, Gideon simply rolled his eyes in heavy annoyance. He aggressively snatched the binder from her hands, fully intending to take absolute, unchecked credit for her brilliant financial catch. That is literally your job, Linnea. You want a shiny gold star for doing the absolute bare minimum? Gideon sneered, adjusting his solid gold tie clip. Linnea swallowed hard, desperately fighting back heavy tears of pure exhaustion. Her feet were heavily swollen, and her back was aching terribly. Trembling, she reached into her faded canvas tote bag and pulled out a small, brightly wrapped box with a silver ribbon. I know it's boss's day today, sir," Linnea said softly, pushing the box across the desk. "I couldn't afford much, but you always complain about your hands cramping when you sign massive contracts, so I bought you an ergonomic weighted pen. It's supposed to help ease the tension." Gideon stared at the cheap $15 plastic pen resting in its modest cardboard box as if it were a diseased rat. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even open it. He simply swept his hand aggressively across the desk, carelessly knocking the heartfelt gift directly into the stainless steel trash can. "I use a $500 Mont Blanc, Linnea, not plastic garbage," he spat viciously. Linnea's heart completely shattered, a single hot tear finally escaping and tracing down her pale cheek. She quietly excused herself, utterly devastated. But the toxic executive's cruelty was just beginning, because less than an hour later, Gideon received a phone call from the company's ruthless CEO that would force him to make a deeply wicked, unforgivable choice. The heavy oak doors of Gideon's office violently swung open, and Alaric Sterling, the notoriously intimidating billionaire CEO of Apex Financial, stepped inside. Alaric was a man who worshipped profit margins above human lives. "Gideon," Alaric barked, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. "The vice president of acquisitions position officially opens up next week. You are the absolute front-runner. But the board wants to see total ruthlessness. We are entering a heavy recession. I need you to slash $50,000 from your department's operating budget by tomorrow morning. If you can prove you have the stomach to cut the fat, the VP title, and the $1 million bonus are yours. Do we understand each other?" Gideon's eyes instantly lit up with a blinding, toxic greed. "Consider it done, Mr. Sterling. The fat will be completely trimmed by the end of the day." As the billionaire CEO left the room, Gideon immediately pulled up his department's payroll spreadsheet. His predatory eyes scanned the list of names. He had 3 junior executives working directly under him: Brad, Chad, and Trent. They were completely useless, arrogant men who spent half the day playing virtual golf in the break room and taking 3-hour martini lunches on the company card. Firing just one of them would save the company $80,000. It was the logical, responsible business move to protect the firm. But Gideon didn't want to fire his friends. They stroked his massive ego, laughed at his terrible jokes, and made him feel powerful. Instead, Gideon's cold, calculating eyes slowly drifted across the glass partition to the outer office. He stared intensely at Linnea. She was rubbing her swollen belly, looking incredibly pale and exhausted as she frantically typed up his quarterly reports so he wouldn't miss his deadline. She made exactly $45,000 a year. Her paid maternity leave benefits, which were set to legally kick in exactly 5 days from now, would cost the department an additional $5,000. If he fired her right now, brutally stripping her of her health insurance right before she gave birth, he would hit Alaric's budget goal perfectly. A sinister, deeply wicked smile slowly crept across Gideon's face. He picked up his desk phone, entirely ready to destroy a vulnerable pregnant woman's life just to secure his own promotion. He had absolutely no idea that the silent, unassuming security camera hidden in the corner of his office was actively recording every single second of his horrific betrayal. Gideon slowly lowered the desk phone, his dark, calculating mind already rapidly constructing the most ruthless way to execute his plan. But before he delivered the killing blow to his pregnant assistant, he needed to solidify his toxic alliance. He casually buttoned his custom silk jacket and strolled out of his massive corner office, heading straight for the ultra-exclusive executive break room. Inside, surrounded by imported espresso machines and plush leather sofas, were Brad, Chad, and Trent. These 3 junior executives were the absolute epitome of corporate deadweight. They collectively cost the firm over $600,000 a year in salaries alone, yet they spent their entire afternoon practicing their golf putts on the carpet and charging $300 steak lunches to the company card. Gideon, my man. Brad cheered, wildly waving a putter in the air. We were just talking about taking the corporate yacht out this weekend to celebrate your upcoming VP promotion. Drinks are on you, right? Gideon smirked, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water. The promotion isn't officially mine yet. Alaric just ambushed me. He wants $50,000 slashed from our department's operating budget by tomorrow morning. He wants to see if I have the stomach to cut the fat before he hands me the $1 million bonus. The break room instantly fell completely, terrifyingly silent. Brad's arrogant smile vanished. Chad and Trent nervously exchanged panicked glances. They all knew they were the fattest, most useless assets in the entire department. Whoa, hey. Trent stammered, holding up his hands defensively. We're a team, Gideon, the boys' club, remember? You can't fire us. We know all your secrets. We cover for you when you take those long Friday afternoons off. Relax, gentlemen, Gideon laughed. A sinister, icy sound that echoed off the break room walls. I would never betray my brothers. I'm not cutting any of your salaries. He took a slow sip of his water, his eyes darkening with pure malice. I'm firing Linnea. Brad's eyes widened before he burst into loud, cruel laughter. The pregnant assistant? Oh, thank God. I was so entirely sick of looking at her waddling around in those cheap, faded dresses. Plus, if she went on that 6-month maternity leave, who was going to fetch my dry cleaning? Exactly. Gideon sneered, his toxic ego completely inflated by their validation. Her salary is $45,000. And canceling her paid maternity leave benefits saves us another $5,000. That hits the $50,000 target perfectly. It's a flawless, victimless business move. He had chosen his lazy, parasitic friends over the fiercely loyal woman who had practically built his career. Gideon turned on his heel and proudly marched back toward his office, entirely ready to destroy a vulnerable woman's life. But as his manicured finger hovered over the intercom button on his mahogany desk, he had absolutely no idea that his horrific choice had just crossed a terrifying point of no return. Linnea, Gideon barked into the intercom, his voice dripping with icy authority. My office. Now, through the glass partition, Gideon watched Linnea heavily push herself up from her ergonomic chair, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her lower back. She gathered a thick stack of finalized contracts and slowly waddled into his office, her face pale with extreme exhaustion but carrying a hopeful, fragile smile. Here are the finalized Orion merger documents, Mr. Gideon. Linnea said softly, carefully placing them on his desk. I also just got off the phone with Human Resources. They officially approved my hospital insurance coverage for the baby's delivery next month. With my husband losing his warehouse job, that insurance policy is literally the only thing keeping us from total bankruptcy right now. I just wanted to thank you again for keeping me on staff all these years. Gideon stared at her with dead reptilian eyes. He didn't feel a single microscopic shred of pity or guilt. Instead, he reached into his top drawer, pulled out a single, stark white sheet of paper and aggressively slid it across the polished mahogany desk. What is this? Linnea asked, her voice trembling slightly as she reached for the paper. It's a termination notice, Gideon stated coldly, leaning back in his expensive leather chair and steepling his fingers. Effective immediately. Your position has been entirely eliminated due to budget cuts. Linnea's fragile smile instantly evaporated. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her as white as a ghost. The heavy stack of mail she was holding slipped from her hands, scattering chaotically across the floor. Fired? Linnea stammered, her chest heaving as sheer, unadulterated panic violently seized her lungs. But Mr. Gideon, I've been here for 5 years. I work 12-hour days. I just saved this company $3 million this morning. You are an administrative assistant, Linnea. You are easily replaceable, Gideon sneered, his voice raising in toxic irritation. Your impending maternity leave is a massive financial burden that this department can no longer support. I am trimming the fat, and you are the fat. But then, Gideon dropped the absolute most devastating hammer of all. Because you are being terminated for financial restructuring, there will be 0 severance pay. Gideon continued ruthlessly, watching her completely break down. And your company health insurance policy will be legally terminated at exactly midnight tonight. Linnea's eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing horror. Midnight? She gasped, tears violently bursting from her eyes and streaming down her face. Mr. Gideon, please. I am giving birth in exactly 4 weeks. If you cut my insurance tonight, the hospital bills will literally destroy my family. We will lose our apartment. We will be homeless with a newborn baby. Linnea completely collapsed, falling heavily to her knees on the imported rug right in front of his desk. She was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her swollen belly, begging him for mercy. Please, Gideon, I am begging you, she wailed, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered agony. I covered up your SEC compliance mistakes. I did all of Brad and Chad's paperwork so they wouldn't get fired. I gave you my entire life. You can't do this to my baby. Gideon looked down at the weeping, pregnant woman with profound, sickening disgust. He didn't see a human being in pain. He saw a pathetic annoyance ruining his afternoon. Security. Gideon barked into his desk phone, completely ignoring her tears. I need an immediate escort on the 72nd floor. A terminated employee is refusing to vacate the premises. Less than 2 minutes later, 2 massive, intimidating security guards stormed into the office. They aggressively grabbed Linnea by the arms, hauling the heavily pregnant, sobbing woman to her feet like a common criminal. As they dragged her out of the glass office and through the bustling bullpens, dozens of employees stopped and stared. Brad, Chad, and Trent stood by the water cooler, openly snickering and pointing at her as she was humiliatingly escorted toward the elevator banks. Just before the heavy steel doors of the elevator closed, Linnea desperately ripped her arm away from the guard. Her tears suddenly stopped. She locked eyes with Gideon, who was standing proudly in the doorway of his office. And in that terrifying, singular moment, the fragile, submissive assistant completely vanished, replaced by a look of absolute, chilling authority that sent a bizarre shiver down Gideon's spine. You chose money over loyalty, Gideon, Linnea whispered, her voice carrying a terrifying prophetic weight that echoed through the lobby. You will deeply regret this day. Gideon loudly scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as the elevator doors violently slammed shut. He proudly marched back to his desk, picked up the phone, and confidently dialed the CEO, Alaric Sterling, to brag about how ruthlessly he had just slashed the budget. He leaned back in his $3,000 chair, feeling completely invincible. He was entirely convinced he had just secured his massive promotion and $1 million bonus. He had absolutely no idea that the small blinking red light on the smoke detector directly above his mahogany desk wasn't a smoke detector at all. It was a high-definition, live-feed hidden camera installed secretly by the board of directors. And it had just recorded every single sickening, monstrous second of his betrayal. 3 agonizing weeks had passed since Linnea was brutally dragged out of the Apex Financial Tower, and Gideon's supposedly brilliant master plan was violently blowing up in his face. When Gideon fired his pregnant assistant to secure his promotion, he genuinely believed his life was going to become a paradise of wealth and power. But karma is a terrifyingly efficient force, and it didn't take long for the toxic executive's entire professional empire to completely collapse without the woman he had treated like garbage. The 72nd floor was no longer a well-oiled machine. It was an absolute, chaotic nightmare. Without Linnea working 12-hour days to meticulously double-check the contracts, catastrophic mistakes began slipping through the cracks. Brad, Chad, and Trent, the lazy bros Gideon had refused to fire, proved to be completely and utterly useless. In just 21 days, Trent had accidentally emailed a highly confidential client list to a rival firm. Brad had charged a massive $12,000 weekend trip to Miami on the company card, claiming it was client outreach. And worst of all, Chad had completely fumbled the paperwork for the $3 million Orion merger that Linnea had previously saved. Gideon was sitting at his sprawling mahogany desk, violently pulling at his hair. His once perfectly slicked hair was a messy, sweaty disaster. The custom-tailored Italian silk suit he wore was heavily wrinkled, completely soaked through with the cold sweat of pure, undeniable panic. He furiously pounded his fists against his keyboard, desperately trying to salvage the corrupted Orion files. But he couldn't do it. He didn't know the passwords. He didn't know the formatting. He realized with a sickening heavy drop in his stomach that he actually had absolutely no idea how to do his own job. Linnea had literally been doing the work of 4 executives for 5 years, and without her, Gideon was drowning in a highly public, humiliating failure. And just as he picked up his desk phone, completely prepared to swallow his massive pride and beg his former assistant to come back, he made a discovery that made his blood run completely ice cold. Gideon dialed Linnea's number, heavily intending to offer her a temporary consulting fee to fix the Orion merger before the CEO found out. But as he pressed the phone to his ear, he didn't hear a ringing tone. "The number you have dialed has been permanently disconnected," the automated voice echoed coldly through the receiver. Gideon slammed the phone down in sheer terror. Disconnected? She was entirely off the grid. The horrifying realization violently slammed into his chest. By aggressively canceling her health insurance and stripping her of her income exactly 4 weeks before she gave birth, he hadn't just fired her. He had completely destroyed her family's ability to survive. She had likely lost her apartment just as she had warned. But Gideon's toxic brain didn't feel a shred of genuine guilt for her suffering. He was only terrified about what her absence meant for his own selfish career. Suddenly, the intercom on his desk loudly buzzed, making Gideon jump out of his $3,000 chair. "Gideon," the terrifyingly deep voice of Alaric Sterling, the billionaire CEO, boomed through the speaker. "The Supreme Board of Directors has just flown in from overseas. They are convening in the master boardroom on the 80th floor in exactly 10 minutes. They are highly aware of the recent turbulence in your department. They are ready to officially finalize the vice president position. Do not be late." Gideon felt the air violently escape his lungs. His massive promotion was on the line, but if the board looked too closely at the disastrous numbers from the last 3 weeks, he wouldn't just lose the VP title, he could be fired. He frantically wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief, heavily relying on his toxic arrogance to survive. He completely convinced himself that his ruthless charm could cover up his massive failures. He just needed to blame the mistakes on Brad, Chad, and Trent, throw them under the bus, and claim his throne. But as Gideon rushed toward the private executive elevators, he was entirely unaware that the trap had already been masterfully set. When Gideon stepped out of the elevator onto the blindingly bright, heavily guarded 80th floor, the atmosphere was thick with a terrifying, suffocating tension. Dozens of massive, heavily armed private security guards in black suits lined the imported marble hallways. Gideon frowned, aggressively adjusting his silk tie. Apex Financial was a massive corporation, but this level of security was entirely unprecedented. It looked like the President of the United States was visiting. "What is going on here?" Gideon snapped at a nearby receptionist, demanding answers with his usual arrogant entitlement. "The majority shareholder is here, Miss Gideon," the receptionist whispered, her eyes wide with deep reverence. "The Vanguard Trust. They own 65% of Apex Financial, but they have operated entirely in the shadows for the last 5 years. No one has ever seen the face of the supreme owner. Until today. The true boss has officially stepped out of the shadows to personally oversee your promotion." Gideon's heart hammered violently against his ribs. The supreme owner? The ultimate billionaire who literally owned the very ground Gideon walked on? A massive wave of arrogant excitement completely replaced his fear. This was his ultimate chance. If he could charm the supreme owner, he would be untouchable. He would be a king. He proudly puffed out his chest, completely prepared to walk into that boardroom and deliver the performance of his life. But as the heavy, solid oak doors of the master boardroom slowly swung open, revealing the dim, heavily cinematic lighting inside, Gideon's toxic confidence began to severely crack. The 80-foot mahogany table was completely filled with the most powerful, intimidating executives in the world. And sitting at the very head of the table, facing completely away from Gideon in a massive, high-backed black leather executive chair, was the mysterious supreme owner. Gideon confidently cleared his throat, plastering on his fake $1,000,000 smile as he stepped into the room. He was entirely ready to conquer the world. He had absolutely no idea that the massive 80-inch screen mounted on the wall was about to violently destroy everything he had ever worked for. The air inside the master boardroom was terrifyingly thick, heavy with an absolute, suffocating silence that made Gideon's skin crawl. Dozens of the most elite ruthless board members in the world sat rigidly around the massive 80-foot mahogany table. Not a single person was speaking. Not a single person was even breathing loudly. At the head of the table, facing the sprawling floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, sat the mysterious supreme owner of the Vanguard Trust, hidden entirely from view by the high back of a towering, black leather, executive chair. Alaric Sterling, the famously intimidating billionaire CEO who had ordered Gideon to cut the budget, was standing near the front of the room. But Alaric didn't look intimidating right now. He looked absolutely terrified. His face was ghostly pale and he was sweating profusely, nervously gripping the edges of his expensive tablet. Gideon, driven by pure, unfiltered toxic arrogance, completely ignored the ominous atmosphere. He aggressively adjusted his solid gold tie clip, plastered on his most charismatic, predatory smile, and proudly marched toward the center of the room. He was entirely convinced this was his coronation. Esteemed board members, Mr. Sterling, and to the supreme owner of the Vanguard Trust, Gideon began, his voice booming with toxic confidence. I am Gideon. Over the past month, I have flawlessly executed the financial restructuring of the acquisitions department. I successfully trimmed the fat, aggressively eliminated useless liabilities, and saved this company a massive amount of capital. I am the ruthless leader this firm desperately needs to navigate the coming recession. Gideon paused, eagerly waiting for the applause. He expected the board to nod in deep admiration. He expected the mysterious billionaire in the chair to turn around and immediately hand him the vice president title. Instead, the supreme owner slowly raised a single hand from the armrest of the chair. It was a clear, undeniable command for total silence. Gideon's arrogant smile slightly faltered. The hand holding a sleek, silver remote control simply pressed a single button. Instantly, the massive 80-inch digital screen mounted on the wall behind Alaric violently flickered to life. The boardroom lights completely dimmed, plunging the room into a heavy cinematic darkness. Gideon turned toward the screen entirely expecting to see his glowing financial spreadsheets. But what he saw made his blood instantly freeze in his veins. It was high-definition, crystal-clear footage from inside his own private office. The camera angle was looking directly down at his mahogany desk from the smoke detector. The room echoed with the sound of his own venomous voice as the footage played the exact moment Linnea had tried to give him his boss's day gift. I use a $500 Mont Blanc. Linnea. Not plastic, garbage. The digital Gideon spat viciously on the screen, as his hand violently swatted the small, brightly wrapped box directly into the trash can. A collective, horrified gasp echoed around the boardroom. Gideon physically stumbled backward, a cold, terrifying sweat violently breaking out across his forehead. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, like a trapped bird. Wait, Gideon stammered, frantically waving his hands. That is completely taken out of context. I can explain, but the video didn't stop. The footage aggressively fast-forwarded to the horrific climax of his betrayal. The entire board watched in sickening silence, as Gideon handed the sobbing, heavily pregnant woman her termination notice. Your company health insurance policy will be legally terminated at exactly midnight tonight. His cruel, reptilian voice blasted through the massive surround sound speakers. I am trimming the fat. And you are the fat. Gideon watched himself call security. He watched two massive men aggressively drag a weeping, terrified pregnant woman out of his office. And then, the ultimate nail in his professional coffin played loudly for all to hear. The audio of Gideon bragging to Brad, Chad, and Trent in the break room about how he was keeping their useless, bloated salaries while firing the pregnant assistant to save a few pennies. The video abruptly snapped to black. The boardroom lights violently flared back on, blindingly bright. Gideon's legs completely gave out. He heavily grabbed the back of a leather chair just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His massive ego was completely, utterly shattered. He was entirely exposed as a toxic, incompetent monster in front of the most powerful people on Earth. Mr. Sterling. Gideon choked out, desperately turning toward the pale CEO. You told me to cut $50,000. You demanded ruthlessness. I was just following your direct orders. I told you to eliminate the lazy, useless deadweight costing this company millions. Gideon, Alaric spat, his voice trembling with genuine terror. I did not tell you to brutally strip a fiercely loyal, pregnant woman of her health care so you could protect your incompetent drinking buddies. Before Gideon could spew another desperate, pathetic lie, a voice echoed from the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. You thought you were a financial genius, Gideon, the voice said quietly. It was a feminine voice. Smooth, authoritative, and terrifyingly familiar. But you were so blinded by your own toxic arrogance, you couldn't even recognize the absolute true value of the people standing right in front of you. Gideon stopped breathing. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as the massive black leather chair slowly, deliberately swiveled around. When the supreme owner finally faced the room, Gideon felt a violent, crushing pressure slam into his chest, entirely paralyzing his lungs. Sitting in the chair was not some mysterious elderly billionaire. It was Linnea. But she was no longer wearing the faded, cheap maternity dresses from the discount department store. She was draped in a breathtaking, custom-tailored, stark white designer maternity suit that radiated unimaginable wealth and absolute, terrifying power. Her posture was flawless. Her eyes, once submissive and exhausted, were now blazing with the unstoppable fire of an apex predator who had just trapped her prey. Linnea, Gideon whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. What are you doing in that chair? My father founded the Vanguard Trust 30 years ago, Linnea stated, her voice echoing with undeniable authority as the entire board of directors bowed their heads in deep respect. When he passed away 5 years ago, I inherited 65% of this entire empire. But before I officially took the throne as Supreme Chairwoman, I needed to know exactly what kind of monsters were running my company. Gideon's jaw completely dropped, his mind violently short-circuited. The worthless assistant he had viciously abused, underpaid, and brutally fired didn't just work for the company. She owned the entire skyscraper. She owned the board. She owned him. I went deep undercover, Linnea continued, her piercing eyes locking onto Gideon's terrified face. I worked 12-hour days. I scrubbed your catastrophic financial mistakes. I wanted to see if absolute power would corrupt you, or if you had even a microscopic shred of humanity left. Gideon completely collapsed to his knees right there on the imported marble floor. Tears of pure, unfiltered panic violently streamed down his face. Linnea, I am so deeply sorry, Gideon wailed, desperately reaching his hands out toward her like a beggar. I didn't know. If I had known you were the owner, I would have treated you with the utmost respect. I would have given you whatever you wanted. Please, forgive me. If you had known I was the billionaire owner, you would have kissed my feet. Linnea replied coldly, utterly unmoved by his pathetic tears. But true character is never defined by how you treat the CEO, Gideon. It is exclusively defined by how you treat the helpless. How you treat the people who can do absolutely nothing for you. Linnea reached into the pocket of her stark white designer blazer. She pulled out the exact same small, brightly wrapped box she had tried to give him on Boss's Day. The $15 cheap plastic garbage he had aggressively thrown away. You mocked this gift, Linnea whispered, the room falling terrifyingly silent. But if you had possessed even an ounce of humility to open it, you would have found the ultimate prize. Linnea slowly untied the silver ribbon and opened the box. Resting inside wasn't a cheap plastic pen. It was a solid platinum, diamond-encrusted flash drive. This drive contains the master access codes to the Vanguard Trust's inner circle, Linnea revealed, dropping the ultimate, life-shattering bombshell on Gideon's head. I was going to promote you to global vice president. I was going to hand you millions. All you had to do was show 1 single ounce of gratitude for a $15 gift. Instead, you threw it in the trash, and then you tried to destroy my family's survival just to save your own skin. Gideon let out a loud, agonizing sob, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of what his toxic ego had just cost him. He was entirely trapped, backed into a corner with absolutely no escape route, unaware that Linnea was about to drop a final, devastating hammer that would permanently end his entire existence in the corporate world. Gideon remained entirely collapsed on the cold, imported marble floor of the master boardroom, his expensive custom-tailored Italian suit soaking up the heavy tears of his own catastrophic destruction. He stared up at the solid platinum, diamond-encrusted flash drive resting perfectly in Linnea's palm. It was the key to a global empire. It was the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, wealth, and prestige, and he had literally thrown it in the garbage because it was wrapped in cheap paper. "Linnea, please," Gideon wailed, his voice cracking violently as he desperately clutched at the edge of the 80-foot mahogany table. "You have to understand the pressure I was under." Alaric demanded I cut the budget. "I made a terrible, stupid mistake, but I am still the sharpest financial mind in this entire building. Please, don't take my career away. I have a massive mortgage on my penthouse. I have luxury car payments. I will lose absolutely everything." Linnea looked down at him, her expression entirely devoid of pity. She gently rested her hand on her prominent, 8-month baby bump. Standing tall in her stunning stark white designer maternity suit. "You didn't care about my rent when you fired me," Linnea stated, her voice slicing through the terrifying silence of the boardroom like a perfectly sharpened blade. "You didn't care about my unborn child when you aggressively terminated my health insurance at midnight. You looked a weeping pregnant woman directly in the eyes and you called her fat that needed to be trimmed. You do not have a sharp financial mind, Gideon. You have a rotten, toxic soul." Gideon sobbed hysterically, burying his face in his trembling hands. But Linnea was not finished. She turned her piercing, authoritative gaze toward Alaric Sterling, the billionaire CEO who was currently sweating profusely by the digital screen. "Mr. Sterling," Linnea commanded, her voice echoing with undeniable supreme authority. Alaric physically jumped, practically standing at attention. "Yes, Madam Chairwoman, you cultivated this toxic, ruthless environment," Linnea scolded, her eyes blazing with absolute judgment. "You taught your executives that human beings are just numbers on a spreadsheet. Effective immediately, your $1 million annual bonuses are permanently suspended. If I ever see another employee treated as disposable under your leadership, you will be the next one permanently removed from this building. Am I understood?" "Yes, Madam Chairwoman. Completely understood." Alaric stammered, bowing his head in deep, humiliating submission. Linnea then turned her attention back to the broken, weeping executive on the floor. She picked up a sleek silver tablet from the table and tapped a single button. "As for you, Gideon," Linnea continued coldly, "you chose to protect Brad, Chad, and Trent. You chose your toxic boys club over loyalty. So, let's see how your friends are doing right now." The massive 80-inch screen behind them violently flickered. The hidden camera footage disappeared, instantly replaced by a live security feed from the ground floor lobby of the Apex Financial Tower. Gideon slowly looked up through his tears, his jaw completely dropping in absolute, sheer horror. On the screen, Brad, Chad, and Trent were not just being fired. They were being aggressively escorted out of the building in shiny steel handcuffs by highly intimidating corporate fraud investigators. "In my 3 weeks away, I ordered a full forensic audit of your department," Linnea revealed, dropping the final life-shattering hammer. "Brad's $12,000 Miami vacation on the company card? That is felony corporate embezzlement. Trent leaking our confidential client list? That is industrial espionage. And because you are their direct supervisor who intentionally covered up their crimes to protect them, you are entirely legally liable." Gideon's heart completely stopped. The air violently vanished from his lungs. He wasn't just losing his massive salary. He wasn't just losing his corner office. He was facing total, absolute ruin. "Security," Linnea commanded, her voice ringing out with absolute finality. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom violently swung open. Striding into the room were the exact same 2 massive, intimidating security guards that Gideon had eagerly called to drag Linnea out of his office 3 weeks ago. "Escort Mr. Gideon off my property," Linnea ordered, turning her back on him completely. "He is officially terminated, effective immediately. 0 severance. Cancel his health insurance at midnight." "No. No. Please." Gideon screamed hysterically as the 2 massive guards aggressively grabbed him by the arms, hauling him violently to his feet. "Linnea, I'm sorry. Give me one more chance. I'll do anything. I'll scrub the floors, please." But his desperate, pathetic screams fell on completely deaf ears. The entire board of directors watched in absolute, disgusted silence as the once arrogant corporate shark was humiliatingly dragged backward out of the boardroom, his expensive Italian leather shoes squeaking loudly against the imported marble. Gideon was violently dragged through the bustling, blindingly bright hallways of the 81st floor. Dozens of executives, secretaries, and junior analysts stopped and stared, openly pointing and whispering as the notoriously cruel senior director was paraded through the building like a common criminal. When the heavy steel doors of the elevator finally slammed shut in Gideon's face, sealing his absolute doom, Linnea took a deep, calming breath. She slowly sat down in the massive black leather executive chair at the head of the mahogany table. Looking out over the sprawling city skyline, the toxic predators had been permanently removed. The empire was finally safe. Months later, Linnea welcomed a beautiful, healthy baby girl into the world, surrounded by the absolute best medical care her multi-billion-dollar trust could provide. She transformed Apex Financial into a company that fiercely protected its workers, implementing massive paid family leave programs and strict anti-bullying policies. And as for Gideon, completely blacklisted from the entire financial industry and buried under massive legal fees from the embezzlement scandal, he lost his luxury penthouse and his expensive cars. The man who once wore $3,000 silk suits and laughed at minimum wage workers was eventually forced to take a grueling minimum wage job working the graveyard shift at a dirty, run-down toll booth. Sitting alone in the freezing, cramped plastic booth, watching wealthy executives drive past him in their expensive cars, Gideon was finally forced to swallow the hardest, most devastating pill of his entire existence. His massive ego hadn't protected him. His ruthless ambition hadn't saved him. In the end, he had completely destroyed his own life, all because he believed his shiny title made him better than the person fetching his coffee. The lesson from this diary, in our endless pursuit of success, we are often brainwashed into believing that ruthlessness is a virtue and empathy is a weakness. We judge a book by its cover, dismissing the quiet, hard-working people in the background because they don't wear expensive suits or hold powerful titles. But true value is never found in a bank account, and true leadership is never shown by how violently you can crush those beneath you. When you choose greed over loyalty, and arrogance over kindness, you will eventually find yourself completely alone, utterly ruined by the very people you once thought were disposable. Every moment has a meaning, but not every truth is easy to face. If this lesson resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe. Comment loyalty over money below if you believe that a kind heart is infinitely more valuable than corporate greed. This is Moments and Meanings by Anne, and I'll see you in the next story.